And this is why information and knowledge is everything. Because what will sometimes happen is a person will get into a narcissistic, intimate relationship in adulthood. It'll go south. Perhaps even the narcissist will leave them, or they'll leave the narcissist. Maybe the narcissist cheated or something. But they actually won't understand what they left. They'll say, that was toxic, that didn't feel good, but they won't understand some of the key elements like radical acceptance. This is not going to change. There was nothing you could have done to make it different. But if there's a real examined look at like, oh, this is what this is the architecture, this is what was happening, and this is not going to change. And when I see these particular patterns, these are red flags, that it can't just be blindly going through the relationship and then going into another, because you will pick the same person. But I'll often say when a person leaves a toxic relationship, I recommend 1 year of what I call emotional dialysis.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to yet another episode of I Love Being Sober. My name is Tim Westbrook, and I'm the CEO of Camelback Recovery here in the always sunny and always sober Scottsdale, Arizona, where my team and I, over the course of many years, have helped thousands of people on their path to recovery. We started this show because there's so much misinformation about addiction treatment, mental illness, and recovery in general. There's so much more to recovery than just going to inpatient treatment, than just going to 12-step programs, than just seeing a therapist. And I'm a huge advocate for the 12-step program. AA saved my life, but there's so much more to it. And to find long-term recovery, my experience and what I've seen is for a person to live happy, joyous, and free, there's just a lot more to it. And that comes down to the lifestyle habits and living a different life and living an honest life. And it's much more than just stopping the drinking and the drugs and stopping the addictive behavior. So those are the types of things that we talk about on this show. Today, I'm so happy and excited to have Dr. Ramani here with me. Dr. Ramani is a licensed clinical psychologist in Los Angeles, California, and professor of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles. She is also a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. Additionally, she is the founder of Luna Education, Training and Consulting, LLC, a company focused on providing content and education about high conflict and antagonistic personality styles, such as narcissism and their impact on mental health, relationships, families, and the workplace. Dr. Ramani is also the founder or the co-founder of the Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Alliance, a collaborative professional group of therapists and coaches working with clients experiencing these relationships. She takes on entitlement and incivility in Don't You Know Who I Am? How to Stay Sane in the Era of Narcissism, Entitlement, and Incivility. She is the author of the Modern Relationship Survival Manual, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Surviving a Relationship with a Narcissist, and of You Are Why You Eat. Change Your Food Attitude, Change Your Life. She also has a popular YouTube channel that focuses on narcissism and difficult relationships. Her work has been featured at TEDx on a wide range of media platforms, including the Today Show, Discovery, Bravo. Dr. Ramani's research on personality disorders has been funded by the National Institute of Health, and she is a consulting editor of the Scientific Journal of Behavioral Medicine. Dr. Ramani is an honest, authentic, and brutally honest voice on the struggles raised by narcissism in the U.S. and globally. Dr. Ramani, I'm so grateful to have you here. Thank you. And
my pleasure.
This is her book.
Thank you.
Don't You Know Who I Am? And today we're going to talk about narcissism, how it relates to addiction, and what are the can you treat narcissism? Is there a 12-step group for narcissism? There's a lot. This is a big subject, especially over the past few years in the news. There are lots of people out there. And so we're gonna talk about that. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Tim. It's so nice to see you again.
Yes. So tell me about your journey and how you got to where you are today.
So in my journey, I was trained as a sort of a traditional clinical psychologist headed for my research and academic career, which I've done. And And then as I was doing my research, I'm a professor at Cal State LA. I started noticing a pattern that had actually been brought to me by students that were working out in the field in a clinical setting. And they'd come back to our main setting at Cal State LA, and they'd be so exhausted. And they'd say, oh my gosh, these people are so difficult. And I was listening to them, and the pattern they were really describing was of this kind of high conflict, antagonistic style, and it never changed. And these patients were wreaking havoc on clinic staff, the front line staff. Like, I thought, well, these people really are almost sucking up more resources as one person in these places than 15 other sort of healthy people would. And so that led to an area of research looking specifically at personality disorders, specifically in the area of HIV and how it was associated with a whole host of outcomes. But then I also have a clinical practice. I'm a licensed psychologist. And in my practice, I was seeing people coming up over and over with describing marriages, sometimes families of origin, characterized by similar patterns. People who were just rigid and difficult and manipulative and unempathic and entitled. And I would talk them through it and say, this is a pattern that's not likely to change. And over time, I've read more and more of the literature. It's clear these people do not change if you have this narcissistic pattern. That culminated in my book, Should I Stay or Should I Go? And then I really started going, and it was still doing this work very quietly, Tim. I have to be honest with you. The 2016 election took this word and pushed it into the public consciousness. And what was happening was there was sort of this slow, quiet buildup of people talking about these issues. The word came much more into the public lexicon. And then I started working with more and more clients, and I'm like, wow, this is a problem. And the mental health world doesn't want to identify it. And I thought, this is actually troubling, because a lot of mental health practitioners aren't trained in it, didn't think it was a thing. We can work on anything. Don't be mean to the narcissists. They've gone through a lot too. And I was like, wow. So what we found is we'd almost become a culture made up of three sets of people: the narcissists, their enablers, and the people who are being victimized by both the narcissist and their enablers. And I said, this is not going to work well. And if the mental health world won't talk about this, then I will. And that's how we slowly got up into launching this YouTube channel. So it was and then when the magnitude of the issue hit me, I thought, this is really going to require me almost going off book a little bit and creating public awareness of this issue, because a lot of people either can't afford the help, and a lot of therapists out there aren't trained to give the help. And that's how I got here. That's the journey.
Okay. Awesome. And yeah, and I've done a little bit of searching on the internet prior to meeting with you today. And there are not a lot of people that are talking about narcissism on the internet.
Well, there's a lot of people talking about it, but a lot of it's not being done by traditional mental health practitioners. Does that make sense? Because there's actually over 9 million YouTube videos on narcissism.
Wow. Okay.
Over 9 million. Yeah, it's a lot. But the thing is that many times they're coming at it from the perspective of, this happened to me, and it's very first person, versus things that are grounded in what little science there is out there, and saying to people, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what you want to keep in mind, and here's how you can move forward. And so that's the piece that sort of people are still struggling with, is how do we help people who are being affected by these relationships? It turns out, Tim, that I actually do work with clients who are narcissistic, and I feel like Sisyphus. I push the rock up, but we rocks back down at the bottom of the hill, over and over and over again. There's just very little change here.
Is narcissism on a spectrum?
It is on a spectrum. I think at the milder ends of the spectrum, you really have someone who's a bit more almost psychologically immature and emotionally stunted. They're the people who are forever stuck in adolescence. They're poorly regulated. They concern themselves with somewhat more immature pursuits and concerns. They're 60 years old and they still got to make sure they have a hot girlfriend. You're like, okay, there's not a lot of substance, but they're not harmful. They're superficial. They tend to be validation seeking. At 65, they're still doctoring up their images online so they look good on Instagram. Okay, so there's a stuntedness to it, but there's not the kind of malevolent cruelty. At the other end of the spectrum, that's where we see people who are exploitative, manipulative, sadistic, dangerously paranoid, harmful, very harmful, and can be dangerous in close relationships, can be dangerous if they're in your family, and not just dangerous like from a criminal perspective, but really dangerous psychologically.
Right. So what is narcissism?
So narcissism is a personality style that is characterized by lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, a chronic need for admiration and validation, arrogance, a superficiality, a difficulty frustrating, difficulty regulating emotional states related to things like frustration and disappointment, and really poor stress tolerance, a need to control other people or at least control the narrative, um, a tremendous hypersensitivity to criticism, hypocrisy. They can dish it out, they can't take it.
Right.
And then at the core of it all, though, they're deeply, deeply insecure. And that insecurity can come out as victimhood, sullenness, resentfulness, particularly if they don't get their own way. When you first meet the narcissist, because of the grandiose exterior, they can come off as very charming and charismatic and confident, which is why a lot of people get sucked in.
Right, right. Why is it important to understand narcissism?
It's absolutely critical in the day and age in which we find ourselves to understand narcissism for myriad reasons. I mean, probably the foremost is so you don't end up with somebody like this, because to have an intimate relationship like this is actually not good for you. To marry someone like this is actually potentially fiscally dangerous for you. To try to raise kids with someone like this is going to mess up the kids and probably you, especially if you get a divorce and you face a very contentious sort of a custody fight. But it also has implications for things like the workplace. A lot of people say, yeah, this guy's toxic, but it's the best place in town to work. And before you know it, your therapy bills outweigh any extra money you made working at such a hot shot place, because that kind of toxic boss was so unsettling. This could be a family of origin issue. And I think by understanding what these patterns are, people are less likely to personalize what happened in their family of origin. And an invalidating, manipulative parent, instead of it being the narrative one may carry of, well, I'm not enough, it's rather, that person was not fit to raise kids, and that wasn't my fault. It was just my bad luck. And so it's really by understanding this, you can be a better gatekeeper for yourself. We really do live in a world that enables these patterns. Oh, come on, give him the benefit of the doubt. Give him a second chance. That's just how he talks. That's what she says. She doesn't mean it. They don't mean it. And so we hear that all the time. And people are like, every cell in my body is telling me this isn't cool, but I don't want to be the person who seems judgmental and dismissive. And that's how it happens. Is there's so many enabling voices out there. We're so obsessed with forgiveness. No, you don't need to forgive. You can let it go, but you don't need to forgiveness. Somebody who had no problem dehumanizing you and invalidating you. And I tell people, abuse is abuse, regardless of the backstory. So if a person, people will often say, you know what, this person had a rough start. Their dad was really rough on them, and other parent was an alcoholic, and it was really hard. So it's hard for them it's hard for them to connect intimately with other people. I say, I feel for them. And I work with clients like that all the time. However, you were not put on this earth to be their punching bag. Abuse is abuse, regardless of the backstory. That's why this is important to understand.
Right. And it's one thing to be compassionate and understanding of their situation. However, having boundaries and
correct.
It's like, I don't need to get into I can be sympathetic to this person or
empathetic even. Yeah.
However, these are my boundaries. I don't need to get into a relationship with this person.
No, you don't. And I think, I call it compassion from a distance. You know, that what I don't want people who've gone through these relationships to find themselves in this position where they feel as though they've become the monster, right? They've gone into Nietzsche's abyss and they've become the monster. That's not a good feeling either. But I said, there's a difference. It's not about becoming the monster and cutting off all compassion, but there's also not about throwing yourself in headlong and continually getting hurt by this person. That at some point you can say, that person's got a rough backstory. I hope they find their path. That path is not going to include me.
Right. And a lot of times people attract the same type of person into their life. So if a person attracts a narcissist, are they likely to continue attracting a narcissist the next time?
I think the reason that sort of endless cycle happens of people getting into relationships with people who have these kinds of, these narcissistic styles, is because they don't understand it. And this is why information and knowledge is everything. Because what will sometimes happen is a person will get into a narcissistic intimate relationship in adulthood. It'll go south. Perhaps even the narcissist will leave them, or they'll leave the narcissist. Maybe the narcissist cheated or something, but they actually won't understand what they left. They'll say, that was toxic, that didn't feel good, but they won't understand some of the key elements like radical acceptance. This is not going to change. There was nothing you could have done to make it different. But if there's a real examined look at like, oh, this is what this is the architecture, this is what was happening, and this is not going to change. And when I see these particular patterns, these are red flags, that it can't just be blindly going through the relationship and then going into another, because you will pick the same person. But I'll often say when a person leaves a toxic relationship, I recommend 1 year of what I call emotional dialysis. It's like what's recommended in sobriety, right? In 12 step, it's not be in a relationship. The same thing with narcissism. I say, give yourself a year, because by giving yourself a year, you will become really well acquainted with your rhythms, your values, what's important to you, and a new person will be less likely to come in and attempt to co-opt that, because you've really had a chance to build that muscle.
God, that's so true. And when I first got clean and sober, I followed the suggestion. I didn't date for a year. And I'll tell you, it was the best thing that I did.
Yes.
It was the best thing I did, because I got to dig. I got to learn more about myself. I got to learn to be with myself. I wasn't relying on another person to make me happy. I wasn't relying on external validation. And next thing you know, the type of person I was a healthier person, and therefore I attracted a healthier person in my life.
That's right. And you learned you learn you're saying this doesn't feel good. You learn to value yourself enough to lay down the boundary. Boundaries are something that people often don't feel that they deserve to set. Right. So when a person almost needs to get themselves elevated to learn their no.
Right. What is gaslighting?
So gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse and manipulation where a person's reality is doubted or denied. In its most simple form, it would be me saying to you something like, you have no right to feel that way, or saying that didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way you said. And it's really, so then if someone does that to you enough, you'll say, maybe that didn't happen. People start doing things like surreptitiously recording conversations saying, aha, it did happen.
Right.
Sometimes it can even be literally physical manipulation of an environment where, for example, to mess with you, a person might move the keys or move the television remote. And you'll say, where's the keys? Because you might have usually put them in a bowl, and say the other person's like, I didn't move them, but they actually did. And so the thing with gaslighting is, while any of those episodes are gaslighting episodes, as far as I see it, the way I see it is gaslighting is a grooming process. Over time and time again, you have no right to feel that way. That's not a valid emotion. It never happened that way. I never said that. You seem to be losing your grip on reality. Are you okay? You've been forgetting things a lot lately. And you hear that enough, 3, 5, 10 times a day. And you have some level of trust in the gaslighter. They're your spouse, they're your family member, they're someone you know. And for some reason, you give some respect to them. They have even more power. And by diminishing you through all this doubt, over time, the gaslighter kind of owns the person they've gaslighted. And before you know it, the gaslighted person is almost just consenting, in the sense that they're capitulating, almost like you'd see in a cult, that they're going along with this new reality that's been handed to them. And they're so confused that they don't really, they want to fight back sometimes, but they almost feel as though they don't know which way is up anymore. That's gaslighting. And it is honestly one of the prime pieces of artillery that a narcissist uses in a relationship.
And it's like, once a person is down, how do they get out of it?
It's not easy. It's not easy at all, Tim. What ends up happening is that, this term gaslighting is something that comes up in other literatures like domestic violence and coercive control. People who are so beaten down in these relationships that they've literally lost their voice. It often is, some of the ways we kind of pull people out of this is returning their reality to them. I mean, as you know, doing the work you do, all trauma all trauma-informed therapy is based on validating the client's reality. So very much the best work that's done with clients who've been gaslighted is is therapists who are trauma-informed, that you let the client tell their story without judgment. You give them exercises to almost start getting acquainted with themselves. Like they can say, I'm warm, and say, okay, then you're warm. You want me to, I can switch this thermostat, instead of saying, I'm not warm. And then the other person's been gaslighted saying, you're right, it's not warm. Like you let the client really own and be in their reality, and then give them ways to practice that. But then you also help them build out new support networks where they are heard, where they are seen, and where multiple opinions can be held at the same time. You and I could have a conversation where I can share with you a feeling, and you might say, that's actually an interesting feeling. Can you tell me more about that? Or that's a hard feeling to have, or it sounds like that was hard for you, instead of you saying you have no right to feel that way.
Right. So if a person has mental health issues, let's say anxiety, bipolar, depression, how does being in a relationship with a narcissist impact their mental health?
So if a person has an excellent question, Tim. If a person has an existing mental health condition, like you said, anxiety or depression or any number of mental health issues, and they go into a relationship with a narcissist, we will see a significant exacerbation of their symptomatology. A depressed person will become significantly more depressed and may not even feel like they have the resources to fight the confused fight. An anxious person will get paralytic anxiety. A person who is living with bipolar disorder, amidst the confusion, there could even be, sadly, even issues with medication adherence, which could then place that client at greater risk for a manic episode. So it's actually, there are people who go through these relationships and actually go on to develop significant anxiety, significant symptoms of depression, hopelessness, powerlessness, confusion, helplessness, rumination, to the level that when they present at therapy, they actually do look like they have generalized anxiety disorder or PTSD or a major depressive disorder. But in fact, it's all the core of it is being in one of these really confusing relationships. And many times simply educating the person about the relationship can help with that symptomatology. But if a person has an existing mental health issue, one of these relationships could actually set them back years.
Wow. I can only imagine. I mean, with all the gaslighting, it's like,
Yep.
Get it.
Yep.
So how does narcissism affect relationships and codependency?
So, it's a very interesting dynamic. And I always tell people I'm very reluctant to initially use that term codependency when I look at a narcissistic relationship. And I'll tell you why. That some of the issues around codependency in terms of the derivation of self-esteem by catering to the more difficult person in the relationship, and it's often in an addiction framework, sort of kind of doing the dance of two around the addiction. This is more in the narcissistic relationship. What we see is that one partner, the non-narcissistic or the less narcissistic partner, as it were, will keep making justifications for the narcissistic partner, which is definitely a theme we see in codependency. Here's the rub. In a significant proportion of people who are living under these narcissistic relationship conditions, merely educating them on the narcissistic pattern, telling them, hey, did you know that this is a thing and it's never going to change? You're like, what? Wait a minute. This is never going to change? I'm like, no, never. I mean, you're telling me if I don't do this or after he retires or after the, never. They're like, oh, thank you for telling me. And they call the attorney that night. That's not codependency. That's lack of information. Right. Now, I do think there's a subset of clients, even armed with the information, even armed with knowing it's not going to change, will continue down the rabbit hole of justification. Maybe I can try this differently. Thanks. Let me go find a new therapist and all of that. Then you might see something that looks more like a codependent type of pattern where there's such a strong trauma bond that they cannot pull out of this really, really problematic relationship. But I think a pretty decent chunk of cases, once they understand what the writing on the wall is, because no one told them, they're like, yeah, okay, no, I'm getting out. I did not know this. Thanks.
Right. Okay, let's talk about the relation between narcissism and substance use disorder?
It's actually pretty high, and it makes sense why that, no pun intended, but let me tell you why that is that people who are narcissistic have a lot of trouble with regulating their emotional states, particularly, like I said, when they're stressed, frustrated, disappointment, or if they feel abandoned. Under those conditions, people with narcissistic personality styles have a really, really, really hard time regulating their emotions. So what's the best thing to turn to? Substances. And so they do. What we see with many narcissistic individuals is they have a natural draw to stimulants because it really amps up the grandiosity. So they're already grandiose, and now this almost seems to make those grandiose defenses rock hard. However, you will also see that people will use numbing sort of depressant type substances, or even substances like marijuana that feel like they cut through the anxiety, because there's more anxiety in narcissism than a lot of people realize. There's a lot of social anxiety for narcissists who feel like they're being judged socially and all of that. Because of that propensity, the likelihood for the co-occurrence of addiction and narcissism is actually quite high. In addiction, we see the reliance on defenses like denial and rationalization. Those defensive patterns are also very prominent in narcissistic patterns. We also see an egocentricity in addiction. That egocentricity is also observed in narcissism. Here's where things get really, really dicey. For many, many, especially families out there, they're like, oh my gosh, this is such a jerk, so selfish, so mean. I'm going to be so glad when he goes through rehab and comes out, because we're going to get our guy back. We're going to get our son back. We're going to get our daughter back. We're going to get them back. And then the person goes and does 28 days. Maybe they do 6 weeks of great rehab treatment. They come out, they're clean, they're sober, they're going to meetings, but they're as much of a jerk as they always were. The narcissism tends not to go away in rehab. And I have to say, Tim, like one of the issues becomes is a lot of rehab centers don't recognize the narcissism. It's all addiction all the time. And by not recognizing that pattern, narcissism is actually going to increase the likelihood of relapse. Why? Because when they're out, and even if they're in a sober living situation, even if they have a sober living companion, and even if they're going to meetings every day, frustration and disappointment and all that stuff is going to come into life. Life happens. And under those conditions, a person with a narcissistic personality is not going to be able to cope, and they're going to go to the quickest thing they've got, which are substances. And in fact, I would actually say if somebody's working with a narcissist who is in sobriety, I'd say what you want to do is play a little bit of a game with them and put so much pride and ego into their sobriety that they fight for it. Because if you don't make it about that, sometimes it's hard for them to give over to a higher power because they're grandiose enough to think that they're that. So you really are kind of fighting a battle within 12-step, and that you almost need to sort of invite their ego along for the ride and get the ego invested in sobriety as though that's the noble stance. And you might actually get some buy-in there. But I think the families, the spouses, the adult children, when a person leaves rehab and they're narcissistic, and in fact, they might even be more irritable, more entitled, and more nasty than before, because before the substances might have even been masking some of the key antagonistic dynamics. So it can get really messy, and a lot of people feel very frustrated when they see a narcissistic person who comes out of rehab and is back in their lives.
When a person gets clean and sober and they don't do the work, quote unquote, and really dig deep and dig into the trauma and change their lifestyle habits and change their behavior, they call that person a dry drunk.
Yes.
It kind of sounds like so if a person just goes to rehab, which is one of the purposes of this show, I Love Being Sober, there's more to getting clean and sober than just going to treatment, than just going to 12-step meetings. And so how can the narcissism be addressed? Is there how do you go about addressing the narcissism?
I think there has to be an honesty about any mental health or addiction services practitioner working with these clients. I think because addiction is often such a acute concern with the client, like we want to get them safe, especially if they're using something that's putting their health in jeopardy. The acute need to focus centrally on the addiction and the substance or alcohol use totally makes sense. The challenge is that if that becomes the singular focus, that when the personality dynamics get missed, the work does need to be done in rehab around things like mindfulness, mindful awareness of how a person speaks to other people, the building up of self-reflective capacity on how the narcissist impacts other people. Like, are you aware of how you just spoke to that person? Are you aware of how other people are experiencing you? Can you please wait before you speak? Humility, like getting people, having them get their hands dirty, inviting them into other people's stories, and for them to be present with other people's stories without contempt. It really means a well-trained staff that's able to see through that and watch some of that narcissistic stuff play out, even in their nonverbals, eye contact, engagement with the process, ability to engage in entitlement. Oh, come on, man, come on. 10:01, let me have my phone. 10:01, come on, man. Like, I could buy and sell you. 10:01, like, give me one more minute. And no. The answer is no. Now, you might have people leaving against medical advice. You might have, you're used to that. You're an old pro at this, right? But you've seen that entitlement. And so it's really about, how do you set that boundary and still keep people engaged? And then it's also to understand that sometimes you can't break through the narcissistic defenses, and you're going to create, whether it's this dry drunk kind of, this sort of, rubric once they leave. But it's really those interpersonal dynamics. Like, some of them will say, I want to stay sober because I don't want to lose my business, right? So sobriety is entirely linked to the business. It's not the work, but it's like, I still want to be a pillar of my community. I still want to make $1 million trillion. And it's not about, this really engaging in the true deep work of 12-step of getting your life back from addiction. And so it then becomes this, they take the ongoing antagonistic patterns continue, and the investment sadly in sobriety isn't really an investment in sobriety, it's an investment in their business, which is all but guaranteeing they're going to not be sober at some point, because the business is going to let them down. So it's not easy. And I would say that however many times the average relapse is post rehab, I would say multiply that by at least 2. With a narcissist, you're going to have that many more relapses.
Wow. Is there a 12-step program for narcissists?
There's actually not. And I think that it's an interesting way to think of it, right? Like, from the outset, that they have to accept it, that this is what they're always going to be, to commit to change, to making amends. Like, I think a lot of the steps actually could be quite interesting in narcissism. The challenge is that a substantial proportion, not by all means all, but a substantial proportion of people who are narcissistic have absolutely no awareness that this is their pattern. And when it's pointed out to them, they may cop to it for a minute, but then immediately return to it and become so barbed and difficult with anyone who tries to point it out. A lot of people say this isn't even worth the fight. And, and narcissistic individuals are 61% more likely to drop out of psychotherapy. So the odds of keeping them in for the long term, especially when you start trying to drill down and do the deeper work, the first time a therapist says to them something they don't want to hear, they'll often pack it in and leave, and they'll just sort of therapist jump, and then they'll sort of be dismissive of the whole enterprise. These therapists will just take your money and they talk to you and they, forget it. I'll just, I can figure this out. I'd just rather get a massage. Like, they'll be very contemptuous and dismissive. It's a defensive maneuver designed to protect them. It's an interesting thought. The challenge would be, though, that the motivation for change is not nearly at the level you might see in addiction. Because for a lot of these people, their narcissism's working for them. They don't think it's a problem. So, and I think you'd see that at a majority level rather than an addiction. But I definitely think it's an interesting thought.
Right. I mean, they're not happy, joyous, and free, but on the outside, they look good. Maybe they're making money. They have a big house. They own a business. So things seems to be going well for them. So that part they want to keep. They just want to stop using drugs. Right. And so that's different in narcissism. Because for some of them, people will say, like, I don't want to be a nice empathic guy. Like, that means leaving money on the table, or I don't want to be a nice empathic person. That's going to mean leaving, money on the table or getting a worse deal. And the idea, like, so what if you got a worse deal? It seems like that the nature of this deal is you're still walking off with a lot of money. And now a lot more of the employees
are actually going to get a better severance out of this. They're like, why should they get my money? You see, so I'm saying, so you kind of hit this wall that even when the winning is so important, it's so important to them, that pulling them out of that unempathic space can get really, really challenging.
Well, and it's the 12-step program is a program of honesty, and it's about behavior change. It's about doing the next right thing. It's about keeping my side of the street clean. And if keeping my side of the street clean is not in line with making more money, then why would they? Why would
Correct. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so it would be a tough sell in those situations. And I know that 12-step programs and 12-step meetings are very much sort of user-led and user-guided. That feels like putting, the foxes in charge of the hen house. I don't even know who's going to run that meeting, bless their hearts, but I just don't know how that would look.
Right. I'm a grateful recovering narcissist.
Yes, if they're a recovered narcissist, they're like, I don't want to be in a room with all y'all. I'm going.
Right. Wow. Okay. So, are there some treatment centers that are, I guess, geared more for people that are narcissists?
You mean in terms of psychiatric or
just
substance use?
An inpatient treatment center for somebody that's an alcoholic or a drug addict, but it's like, hey, all the narcissists should go to this one, or are they just the more expensive ones?
Tim, bless the hearts of the people who actually, if anyone figured this one out, a treatment program, I don't think it could be 28-day. I think it would have to be longer. That was able to master the narcissism alongside the addiction. It would be worth its weight in gold. I think some people proclaim to do it, but I don't think they're doing it. But I'll tell you why. This isn't the fault of the treatment centers. My read on the literature is that there's absolutely nothing convincing in the narcissism treatment literature that shows long-term efficacy. And so what happens is that even in the scientific literature on the treatment of people with narcissistic personality styles or narcissistic personality disorder, it tends to be research done on very small samples. Sometimes it's more like case reports. You can't generalize from case reports. These are often courses of therapy that last 12 to 18 months, 2 to 3 times a week. And I'm thinking, I don't know many people in the United States of America that can afford therapy with a highly trained therapist 2 to 3 times a week and stay in for 12 to 18 months. That is available to less than 1/10 of the population. So when you're talking, granted, rehab is a much more condensed, so you've got the person around the clock. So it's not outpatient extended for a year. But you're talking about someone so specifically trained in these specific models and really work at them while you're still trying to manage sobriety. It's a very tall order, and you need a uniquely motivated client. And then you need, outside of that, one heck of an outpatient therapist to work with them in perpetuity. That setup is almost impossible to achieve. I suppose if you had all of that, then sure. But I feel it's a silly thing to proclaim. That's like saying if you moved a personal trainer, a personal chef, and a personal something else into my house, I'd lose weight and look like $1 million. I'm sure I would. I don't have those things. So it's the same thing here.
Well, and the other thing is that they would have to want it.
They'd have to want it. But even if they want it, Tim, my point is, even if they want it, is that without that absolutely pristine top drawer level of treatment, the first time frustration or disappointment or abandonment or stress cross their path, they'll snap.
Yep.
So, what does that mean? Then you create a life that doesn't have those things in it. I don't know what that means, like living in some strange bubble.
Right. Is there, in your experience, are there certain addictions that narcissists are more prone to?
So when we think about I would actually say that they're equally prone to all addictions, because their addictions at the core are regulatory deficits, right? The desire to regulate with something outside of the organism rather than to self-regulate. So drugs and alcohol are probably going to top the list, but people who have a narcissistic personality style struggle a lot with gambling addiction, with spending addiction, like spending and acquiring, shopping, I guess, food. Struggle with food, and you'll see co-located with eating disorders, or at least very dysregulated eating behavior, either like sort of extremes of starving for reasons of looking a certain way, getting almost obsessive compulsive. I'll only eat this, I'll only eat that in a very certain way. And it's a sort of over controlled to almost offset the chaos of the narcissism. So you definitely see a whole host of dysregulated patterns that will sit alongside narcissism, and often more than one.
Dr. Ramani, we need to wrap up here. How can people learn more about you and find out more about Dr. Ramani?
Probably the best place to go is my website, drramani.com, doctor-ramani.com. And if you go there, you'll see, links to everything I do and the workshops I do. And the other place I'd suggest is people go to my YouTube channel, which is just Dr. Ramani. That is a trove of hundreds of videos on narcissism. So as it relates to families, as it relates to relationships, to workplace, why narcissists do the things they do, why do survivors of these relationships do the things they do. And so all of that's there in a massive library of videos that you can look at at no cost. So there's lots of different ways. I have 2 books, but all of that information's on my website.
Here's her book. Once again, Don't You Know Who I Am? And her YouTube channel is amazing. She's got hundreds of videos that are awesome. Dr. Ramani, thank you so much again.
Thank you, Tim.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thanks everybody for watching. Have a great night.